Boker Tov, everybody, good morning on this fine Sunday morning as we get into learning Torah. Just a special time to learn Torah, start the week with some holiness, with some spirituality, with some positive message. So let's, as we usually do, we start the class with a mitzvah of tzedakah. So we start with a mitzvah, and we also elicit by being kind and doing the mitzvah of tzedakah, so that we bring forth blessing from the Almighty, that we should merit to say the right words. The message should come across properly in the way that it inspires both me and those, or both I and those who are listening. We also always start with a bracha on the delicious gift that God gave us, this wonderful cup of coffee. Say a blessing with me if you have your own cup, or you can answer Amen. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shehakol Nea B'Dvaro. One of the reasons why I'm giving the class early today, although sometimes we do, is because some argue that today is the largest, biggest, most important American holiday, the Super Bowl. And I will say up front, the title of the class is Who is Going to Win the Super Bowl? Do you think I know? So, I guess if you tuned into this class, you feel that I know who is going to win the Super Bowl. So I'll tell you right now up front, I do and I don't, based on the context, based on the message of this class. I do and I don't. In general, I will tell you that I am not a maven. I'm not an expert on football for sure. In my youth, I was a strong Yankees fan, baseball fan. So being a Brooklyn boy, I'm a baseball person. But nevertheless, I have not really followed baseball, just very sort of superficially. I will even over here confess and tell you a story that that might upset you listeners. I don't know if I shared this in the past. So when I was, I don't know, call it, and 10 or 12 years old, I had, I was living in Brooklyn, and I had, together with with a friend, childhood friend, we collected baseball cards. That was a real big thing, and we used to play baseball cards. Give me a thumbs up if you remember. There was different ways of playing with baseball cards. One was, you hold the card, you guess the player, stuff like that. But then there was another way that we played baseball cards, and how to win cards, besides just going to the store and buying, is we would, this way we would toss the cards, and if the card was new and crisp and you knew how to toss it, the card would sort of cut through the air and land as far as possible. And the persons, you would agree with a certain amount of cards tossed, or it was card per card, actually, if I remember correctly. And if your card landed the furthest, you would then win the card that was out there. And I must say that I was good at it. I was often won the contest, and this was not part of my rabbinic training, just that you know that. I was 10 years old, 11 years old. And so we amassed a friend growing up in Brooklyn. We amassed a really impressive amount of baseball cards. We had the entire Yankees team. This goes back in the 70s. We had Thurman Munson and Greg Nettles. And for those who remember what we might call in the yeshiva language, the shtussim, some of our childhood fun in baseball. And but as we got older, we started to be convinced that we were a little too involved, and we want to be involved in holier things. So we made a bonfire and we burnt all our cards. And my kids and others tell me, Today that would have been worth thousands and thousands of dollars. But so that's the story. That's my baseball story, a part of my baseball story. Okay, let's get to the Torah class over here and who's going to win the Super Bowl. So, Baal Shem Tov, we've repeated this statement often. The Baal Shem Tov teaches us that every single thing that we see and hear is a lesson in our service to Hashem, a lesson in our service to God. So I want to take this excitement of the Super Bowl and sports in general, and I want to learn a lesson. And I know I'm treading a little bit on thin ice over here. So if I fall through the ice, maybe you'll help me get up. Because, when you challenge sports, you're really treading on thin ice, in dangerous territory. So I use the Super Bowl opportunity to study Torah. I'm not a sports announcer, and I don't care much about sports. I use this as a catapult, as a door to open here the studying of the parsha. We learned about Elah Mishpatim, and as I will go on, I will explain a little bit and get back to the title of the class: who's going to win the Super Bowl. So the parsha deals with an interesting law. The parsha that we just read, Parshat Mishpatim, which is the parsha. The name Mishpatim means the laws, and it deals with a lot of laws that were last week we read about God giving the Ten Commandments, the Torah to Moses, and this week it continues to give us a lot of the detailed laws that Moses received when he went up to Mount Sinai. And the parsha begins, and these are the laws that you should set before them. And amongst the laws, there's this following law. Okay. It deals with the law of a slave. So listen to this law. I'm going to read over here from the Torah, and we will talk about this. So it says like this: Ki sikna eved ivri. This is the first law in Parshat Mishpatim, following again the week before's Torah portion. So it says like this: if you buy a Hebrew slave, and we once spoke about in general the Torah's whole attitude to slavery, which definitely in today's environment we struggle with. How could the Torah allow slavery? What is it all about? We spoke about it. I know I've given class about it in the past. I'm not sure in this form, but we definitely have given class about that in the past. So we'll leave that for now. If you buy a Hebrew slave who is sold into slavery, this is in the parentheses, based on Rashi's and the Talmudic commentary, who is sold into slavery by the court because he could not repay his theft. So over here we're talking about a slave. The reason why he's a slave is because he committed theft. He could not repay, so the court sells him to the one who he owes the money for, of who he stole from. So he says he shall work for 6 years, but in the 7th year he is to be released without liability. So this is the pretty known law that a slave can only be a slave for 6 years. On the 7th year, you must release him. The Torah goes on to say a couple of different laws, and then the Torah says like this: Vim amor yomar ha'eved. If the slave says the following: I love my master, I will not go free. In other words, the 6th year comes around, we're about to enter into the 7th year. He has now earned his freedom, so he's free to go. But he says, no, I want to stay. I love my master, and I don't want to go. Says the Torah the following: his master shall bring him to the judges of the Jewish court, and standing next to a door, which is attached to a doorpost, his master shall pierce his right ear with a pointed tool or with some sort of drill. He must then serve his master until the Jubilee year. So what's the story over here? The story is that this slave has been given his freedom. However, he says, no, I want to remain a slave. So the Torah says, we don't just say, okay, go ahead, be a slave. We say the master has to go ahead and pierce his ear. He has to be brought to the mezuzah, to the doorpost, and to the door, the delet, the door, and his ear is pierced. Okay, let's understand this, and there's a couple of questions, and this has a very beautiful lesson and relevance to us in our daily lives. So, Rashi goes on to explain, again taken from the Talmud, why does his ear have to be pierced? Why does his ear have to be pierced to a doorpost, and a doorpost which has a delet, which has a door? So here I'm reading a synopsis of the Rashi, as it's placed in this commentary. Why was the ear chosen out of all the organs of the body to be pierced? So he answers, the ear that heard at Mount Sinai, you shall not steal, and then went and stole, shall be pierced. If the slave sold himself into servitude voluntarily, meaning he wasn't sold because of theft, but on his own, so then there's another reason. The reason that the ear is pierced is because the ear that heard from God Almighty, for the children of Israel are slaves to me. Avodayahim, God says, you're my servants. And nevertheless went and inquired a master for himself, therefore his ear should be pierced. Now, this does not explain why the ear should be pierced by a doorpost or by a door. This does not explain some other obvious questions that can be asked here. First of all, why specifically? If the first reason tells us because this ear heard from God that you should not steal, that's why it deserves to be pierced. But here there's an obvious question. Why should the ear not be pierced for violating the laws of kosher? The ear that heard from God, you should keep kosher. Why should the ear not be pierced for violating the Sabbath? In this 10 Commandments, it says you should keep the Sabbath. The 10 Commandments says honor your father and mother. Why is the ear not pierced in that when you violate that commandment from God? Why specifically when it comes to being a slave and you want to remain a slave, is the ear pierced? Number two, another obvious question is, why is the ear pierced only after 6 years that he says, Ahavti es Adoni, I love my master, lo etzei chavshi, I will not go out to freedom? If the reason is because it is the ear that heard from God, don't steal, or is the ear that heard from God that said, you are my slaves, you're my servants, why do we have to wait till after 6 years where he says, Ahavti et Adoni? Why not have the ear pierced immediately when he sells himself, or immediately when he steals? So the Rebbe, in a talk that has been published in Likutei Sichot, volume 11, and I also heard this, or actually read this, written up nicely by Rabbi Ashkenazi from Israel in Hebrew, with a couple of sort of my own thoughts, explains this very beautifully. He says the following. He says, we are human beings. We make mistakes. We commit errors. We commit sins. And that is why there is repentance. And that is why second chances are given. And God, we say every single day in the Amidah, Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu. Forgive us, God, because we have sinned. Forgive us, our Father, because we have sinned. And we end off and we say, Baruch Ata Hashem. And we end off and we say, God who forgives. In other words, we have full confidence that God forgives us. There are degrees in wrongdoing or in errors or in shortcomings. There is where you fall through, so to speak. You mess up. You don't live up to your expectations, to God's expectations. But you recognize and you change course. And then there is where you become a slave and you become what we might call an institutionalized slave. There's a story. It's a pretty fascinating story. And sometimes these stories, they have two sides to it. Sometimes these stories are distant from us. And sometimes the reason why they resonate with us is because we're not so different. So here I have opened here from Wikipedia, a story talking about, I think the United States has the highest rate, and I always mess up of how I pronounce the word recidivism. Is did I pronounce it correct? But you know what I mean, where it's sort of a revolving door, people who are in prison and end up back in prison. The rate, I did not look this up before the class, but my memory tells me something between 30 to 40%, and it might even be higher than that, of criminals who sadly, after serving their term, are so enslaved to their prison life that they cannot be free. They cannot live as free people. Let me tell you this story with Paul Geidel. Some of you might know this story. I have this story here open in front of me on the screen. I'll read some parts of it, and I'll share it with you. Paul Geidel Jr. has the record of the longest serving prisoner in the United States. Paul Geidel was born in 1894. He was the longest serving prison inmate in the United States, who's he earned him a place in the Guinness World Records. He is now the second longest serving inmate next to Francis Clifford Smith, who served 70 years and 31 days. Paul Geidel held this record. He served, I think, for 68 years and 296 days. So I guess you could say almost 69 years. Now, what's his story? His story was like this. Geidel was born in Hartford, Connecticut, to an alcoholic saloon keeper. German-born Paul Geidel Sr. His name was Paul Geidel Jr. His father died in 1900 when Paul was only 5 years old. The boy spent much of his life in an orphanage. He dropped out of school at age 14 and worked a series of jobs in Hartford and New York City hotels. On July 26, 1911, Geidel, 17 years old at the time, robbed and murdered elderly 73-year-old William H. Jackson, a wealthy broker. Jackson was a guest at the hotel on West 44th Street in New York City, where Geidel was working as a bellhop. Geidel entered Jackson's room and suffocated him to death with a rag filled with chloroform. Geidel made off with only a few dollars. Geidel was then sentenced. I'll tell you the story by heart over here. Geidel was then sentenced to prison. And some reason, because of whether bureaucracy and so on, the papers and his sentence details were lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, so to speak, and he ended up staying in prison for many, many years. Although other prisoners came and went, other prisoners, were gone. He was just like a permanent. He became one of the sort of elders of the prison. In fact, even the guards respected him. They would even sometimes take him out to games. This became his life. During his time, remember what went on. There was the Great Depression. There was World War I. There was World War II. He had it good. He was in prison. His life was taken care of. The amazing thing is that a tragedy occurred one day. They remembered him. What year was this? Where we're going over here. Geidel was granted parole in August 1974. He begged the judge. He came before a judge and he asked the judge to please not send him out of prison, not free him. This is my life. His request was granted, and he stayed in prison for another 6 years. I wonder if the judge was influenced by the biblical story. A slave should be for 6 years. And finally, after an additional 6 years, after being in prison, what did we say, for 67 years? He was released and he lived for another 7 years. So here we have a story of a person that was in prison and lived life, his whole life, essentially in prison as a prisoner. I don't know if you know this, that in the 5 books of Moses, in the Torah, Zot HaTorah v'Zot HaTorah Asher Sam Moshe, correct? There is no punishment called prison. Does not exist. There is lashes, there's capital punishment. There is no punishment called prison. We do find someone in prison for a short time as a holding pattern, but not as an end goal punishment. The reason for that, amongst others, is because we were put onto this earth to live life. Let me turn that off. We were put onto this earth to live life. To live. In order to live life, part of being alive as God intended us to live, we are the only ones that were given, the only creature, the only part of creation that were given freedom of choice, the choice to do what's right and wrong, to make the right decisions. Prison is not a godly thing. And in fact, the closest we come to prison is what we have in this week's Torah portion, where instead of sending someone to prison, where unfortunately they either become institutionalized in the sense that where they be just, their whole mentality is a mentality of slavehood, the Torah sets up a reform system, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, the brain is not what it used to be. Words don't come as quickly. Sets up a way of healing the person. You could text me the word if you know the word that's in my head that you're sensing, of rebuilding the person. So by becoming a slave in a family that he stole from, rather than locked in a prison, the chances of becoming a mensch, the chances of true reform in this individual is much higher, much greater. And that's really the objective. The objective is to live, and to live means to have freedom of choice. To live as a human being is intended. This is one of the explanations in Genesis where God says, I will make man in my image. So commentaries, especially the mystical commentaries, means that only man has true freedom of choice. Being in prison or being a slave really limits greatly your freedom of choice, which limits your being a true human being as intended by God Almighty. So why, after 6 years, do we pierce his ears? Because if a person initially commits something wrong, okay, you need to repent. But that doesn't mean that your core being, in a sense, has come to a place where you need some real jolting to get you out of your slave mentality. But if after 6 years you are still not in a place where, when shown the door, that's why we drill his ear by the door, because you're shown the door of freedom, as the Klei Yakar says, and you still say Ahavti es Adoni. You're still so addicted, you're still so enslaved that you can't be a human being as intended, which is the greatest gift that you could have. And purpose fulfillment. Then we have to do something drastic. We have to take the ear and drill it, symbolically meaning that you really, really have to get through to this individual. What's the lesson over here? What's the practical lesson? So, since we're talking about the Super Bowl, and I think a year or two ago I gave just some general lessons that we could learn from football, from sports, and so on. And here is where I said that I might be treading on thin ice or dangerous territory, and I might be thrown, empty cans by the fans. There are societal and individual addictions, enslavements that we have. It's part of life. It's part of the challenge of life. It's part of the struggles of what we're given in order to overcome and make us better people. That's its objective. It's meant there to lift us up. In fact, the word nisayon, test, is also from the word nes, which means to lift up. One of the societal addictions is also sports, which means you can have sports, Super Bowl, football, as a form of entertainment and pleasure, which is fine and wonderful. But it could also become a form of total addiction and enslavement, as can some other things be and become. I think it's apropos that we just read about the Ahavti es Adoni. I love my master, but you don't even realize that although you love your master, but it's a form of enslavement. And therefore, it does not bring you true inner joy. And even if you're experiencing some moments of elevation or ecstasy or so on, but it's not your purpose in life. And if it's not your purpose of who you really are and your mission and your purpose, it cannot bring you the ultimate and true peace. So this is not meant to be a knock on watching the Super Bowl, God forbid. I mean, that would be extremely dangerous on my part. But it is an analysis or evaluation that we should have of what are our addictions and what areas are we truly free. So in the broader sense, let's take the moment here of the 6 days, 6 years, which are akin to the 6 days of the week. And on the 7th year, the slave should become free. So I want to use one practical example of how we can and be truly free in the meaningful sense. Because we all could agree you could live in a free society and yet be internally enslaved. That's the famous message of Passover and Pesach. The Torah over here says after 6 years, on the 7th year, you're free. And the slave says, no, I'm very happy and comfortable and I'm addicted to where I am. It's comfortable. It provides a certain security. I do not have to make my own decisions. I'm being provided for. Why would I want to be free? Let's translate that to the 6 days of the week. 6 days of a week, we are somewhat enslaved to our work, to our hectic schedule. It's life. We have to make a living. And some of us more than others are definitely enslaved to that. But then it comes Shabbat. Shabbat, God says, Kol melachtecha asuya, your work should all be done. How could all your work be done for Shabbos? Comes Rashi from the Talmud and says, when you enter into the Sabbath, you should view your work as it is totally done. Sabbath is a Shabbat, is a time where you are free, totally free to spend meaningful time with your family, where during the week you're distracted and you're fayok, or as Jackie Mason would say, fajavet, fajuvet, I don't know, whatever words he would use. But comes Shabbat, shut it all down. Shut down the phone that is an enslavement to us. Shut down the worries. Shut down the business dealings. Shut down the television or TV or internet or tablet or whatever it might be. And spend meaningful time with your family. Spend meaningful time in the study of Torah. Spend meaningful time in prayer. Go out free. And often we say on Shabbat, Ahavti es Adoni, I love my master. On Shabbat, I need to talk about the stock market. I need to talk about the news. I need to talk about politics. I need to talk about work. Let's not have that need for having our ears pierced. Let's follow what the Torah tells us. To go out free is by meditating on exactly this. God says, once I took you out of Egypt, I gave you the blessing of being servants of God. There's no greater blessing than that, and that assures freedom of all other enslavements. And Shabbat, in terms of the week, is the best time to achieve that. And even during the week, make a special Shabbat time. And I cannot stress, I've said this before, I'll say it again. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to us. I'm talking to us. In the rabbinical world, we have our sort of enslavements, distractions, addictions, and so on. But take the time, make time to be truly free every single day. Take a half hour, spend time with your child, with your family, with your wife, your spouse, and don't be that slave that says, Ahavti et Adoni, I love my master. I love the masters of the time. So who will win the Super Bowl? This is how you're going to win the Super Bowl. You're going to win the Super Bowl. You personally, I personally can win the Super Bowl. Symbolic of something that is not unholy, something that is not forbidden, but yet can be enslaving, a form of enslavement as representing sort of sports in general, and by broader definition, entertainment, social media, and so on. Sports being sort of, and the Super Bowl being the top of the pile in terms of how it grabs our passion year round. Who will win the Super Bowl? I'll tell you how you could win the Super Bowl. If you take the lesson from the Super Bowl and you direct it to have no less commitment, no less passion in where you should be truly free, in the expression of your soul and your connection to your family and your connection to your heritage, in connection to the deeper purposes of life. Learn from the Super Bowl of how to be truly free and attached to the things that you really should be attached to. That's how you and I will win the Super Bowl. That's my thought for today. May your team win. More importantly, may you personally win your Super Bowl challenge. Enjoy the game. Don't turn it into an idol worship. Try to direct and learn from the passion to use it where it's far more important, as we just discussed. And you should have a wonderful week. A gebenchte Woche, as we say in Yiddish. A free week, a truly free week. A commitment and a dedication and the strength to tear yourself away from the Ahavti et Adoni, I love my master. It's good, it's comfortable, it provides me security. The greatest security is by meditating on what God tells us. Lo tignovu, do not steal, which is, of course, staying away from things which are forbidden. And even things which are permitted, but we become enslaved to. Remember, when we became a nation, we were told, humanity was told, Avodai Haim, you are my servants, in the most loving and meaningful and moral and ethical way. And by that, we will be able to enjoy Shabbat, freedom, in the deepest, most rewarding, and most enduring way, both for ourselves and for our kindalach and our family. Have a fantastic week. Thank you for listening. Please share these words of Torah.